feel free to throw a question at me. I have a presentation which is basically my template for presenting the Great Consensus Cleanup, but I don't want to just go through the presentation, which I've done over and over again. I really want to take the opportunity of having everyone in the room to answer specific questions and guide the presentations to your interest. So I'm just going to run through the presentation to trigger your questions. So feel free to shout questions, and please do. All right. The consensus cleanup is a Bitcoin soft fork proposal. It's a proposal to change Bitcoin. The actual Bitcoin consensus rule. It's not about changing the peer protocol or the standardness. It's about changing what Bitcoin actually is by consensus. The changes are minor, and it's not about changing the value proposition of Bitcoin. It's about fixing bugs. It's about fixing bugs in the Bitcoin consensus that are fixable through a soft fork. The cleanup is not a new idea. It's also like some of the bugs that are proposed to be fixed in the soft fork, they date a long back. Like I think time warp was 2011, for instance. It was initially proposed, at least for the first time, as a bundle by Matt Corallo in January of 2019. And I think Matt then stopped working on it when he stopped working on Bitcoin Core at the end of 2019. At the end of 2023, I started looking at it again, initially to try and convince myself of, is it really worth changing Bitcoin over? And should I spend more time looking into it? Well, but as a matter of fact, I think it is. I eventually published on Delving 2 posts about reviving the Great Consensus Cleanup proposal from Matt, which went into the details of the various bugs, the mitigations proposed, and whether we could think of alternative mitigations, and whether, since it's been 5 years by that time, whether we wanted to include more things in the bundle. Along with this public post, I also had a private, semi-private post about the very worst block I could come up with in terms of validation time. It exploits fairly well-known issues in the validation engines among protocol developers, yet I wanted to keep it private to not expose everything to the public, and especially not the scripts to exploit it. So this triggered discussions and update. I continued this research throughout 2024 and published regularly updates on the Delving post, and then people joined, we had discussions, they had interesting inputs, and the proposal, well, the research matured and eventually gave birth to BIP 54, which is the consensus cleanup BIP, which became an actual proposal. Before it was just me researching how bad actually are the bugs. Now I'm actually proposing to fix them. There are 4 bugs that I'm proposing to fix in the consensus cleanup. The two first I like to refer to as actual vulnerabilities, and the last 2 more as weaknesses. Let's go one by one. So the first one, I'm still running through the material, but shout questions, I'm waiting for them. Oh yes, and Walton has a microphone here for anyone who has questions. So time warp. Time warp is a bug which allows a majority miner to drastically increase the block rate. It exploited to its very full potential, it can allow to reset the difficulty back to 1 in 38 days, which at which point Bitcoin is not usable anymore. There is no probably billion tips, billion different chains. You might say, sure, but it takes a majority miner, which is already an assumption that we make. And that's exactly. The threat model of 51% attacks for Bitcoin is as long as someone can keep the energy to maintain an advantage, a majority hash rate on the network, they can censor transaction. So it's absolutely not the same as saying a majority miner that keeps this advantage for 38 days can just wreck the network. Also, I don't think it's very likely that we would see miners actually shooting themselves in the foot and wrecking the network. Instead, I think it's much more likely with the current concentration of mining and potential short-term incentive from the part of the users that we would see miners try to exploit it to a small extent. Like they could increase the block rate by 2x, let's say, 1 block every 5 minutes. And it would, all of those things equal, increase the available supply of block space, and so all of those things equal, reduce fees for short-sighted users. It will allow miners to steal block subsidy from future miners, so also win from the point of view of short-sighted miners, and all this obviously at the expense of the long-term health of the network. How does it work? It works because maybe you've heard before that every 2 weeks, Bitcoin looks at the past 2016 block intervals and compares how long it took to mine these 2016 block intervals and compares it to 2 weeks. If it took more than that, the difficulty is reduced. If it took less than that, the difficulty is increased. Well, it's not exactly that. It actually looks to the past 2016 blocks, which is 2015 block intervals, right? If you have 4 blocks, you have 3 intervals. 0, 1, 2, 3. That's 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3. That's 3 intervals. So there is an off by 1 bug. And this off by 1 bug makes it so the retarget periods do not overlap. So what full nodes on the network look at when they look at how long it took to mine periods of blocks, they look at the timestamp of the last block of a period and the timestamp of the first one. They subtract it to see how long it took. But here, the timestamp of the last block of a period is not the timestamp of the first block of the next period. Therefore, and due to pretty loose constraints on what miners can use as timestamp in their block, it allows, this is an approximation, but it allows a miner to basically hold timestamp back all through a period and use the timestamp as far in the future as possible for the very last block. So basically, what they do is use timestamp at time n when they start the attack. Here, I use 0. For all blocks in the period, again, it's an approximation. Technically, they need to bump by 1 second every 6 blocks, which I just omitted because it doesn't change anything. And arriving at the last period of the first, at the last block of the first period, it's 2 weeks in the future because we're at difficulty D. It took 2 weeks to mine the first period. But then, rolling into the next period, they start by setting timestamp 0 for the first block of the next period. And that's really the issue here, because timestamp is not 0. It should be 2 weeks in the future at this time. And then they continue, timestamp 0, 0, 0. But at this point, you're 4 weeks in the future. So it took 2 weeks to mine the second period. And at this point, the network is going to say, all right, it took 4 weeks to mine the second period. It didn't, but that's what they see, right? So they are going to halve the difficulty. And so for the next period, it's going to take the miner only 1 week. So they are going to put the last block at 5 weeks from the beginning in the future, which is going to divide the difficulty for the next period by 2 divided by 2.5, which is divided by 5. and again and again and again. And you can see how it's compounding very fast. Oh, yes, question.
So not all the, like, they're all zeros, but they don't have to be all zeros, right? Because like as long as median is 0, it's okay, right?
So what the miner wants is really to be restricting the timestamp of the first block of the next period to be as far in the past as possible. This is constrained by the timestamp of blocks that are preceding it, by the median time passed rule, and so it can be more in the future, but then the difficulty is going to be reduced less, if that makes sense.
No, what I mean is like there can be like correct timestamped blocks, but as long as half of those blocks in that epoch is 0 timestamp, it's okay because last 11 blocks timestamp will be 0. So like.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
I understand. You're talking about the MTP rule, which looks at the past 11 blocks. So as long as you can have 5 blocks that come from a miner that is not participating in the attack and setting honest timestamps, doesn't matter because the network is taking the median of the past 11 blocks. So what all nodes are doing for every block, they are going to take the timestamp of the past 11 blocks, sort them, and pick the 6th one in the list. And the timestamp of the current block must be strictly superior to this 6th one in the list. So yes, you don't need so obviously this is assuming 51% attacker, so that you can just reorg out the block of competition, but they do not need to do so.
Yeah. So is it like less than 51% is enough to do this attack? Because like.
No.
Okay.
Well, no.
Okay.
We simulated it with a colleague, and we found that you had very, very little incentive compared to your chances of, by luck, having the last block of a period that is far in the future. And like that was one of the things that I was mentioned in the research as well as. All right, so it takes a 51% attacker, but really a miner, as long as the timestamp is valid, they are not gaining anything from setting it correctly. Can they just try to opportunistically exploit the attack? There is some massive positive externality because if they do and they manage to pull it out, well, everyone is going to benefit. All the set of miners is going to benefit from the lowered, reduced difficulty, but the opportunistic one is going to benefit as well. So the Matai was overthread, but it turns out the incentive is tiny, so tiny that you would expect not it to outweigh the social cost, let's say, of trying to mess with the protocol. Obviously, if we wanted to fix it, we want to fix the proof of work. That's a hard fork. But fortunately, I hope I emphasized enough that the only issue is that the period do not overlap. So the only tiny fix we can do is to require that the first block in a period is not blatantly lower than the timestamp of the last block of the previous period. So you could say, oh, we just ensure that it's stricter, but we're using a grace period as well to make sure that miners somehow don't set a timestamp that is too small, which I don't see how it would happen, but it doesn't cost us anything to basically to just set the 2 hours grace period, so we just set it. All right, that's one. Next up, no question still? Yes, go for it.
All right, I wasn't really paying attention.
That's
I was hoping you could repeat, because I kept thinking that you're going to talk about the problem. So I sort of tuned it out because I feel like I understand the problem, but I didn't understand. Are you covering the consensus fixes later, or did you already cover that and I just didn't pay attention?
For the time warp?
Yeah.
You didn't pay attention. It was the...
No, but okay, so this was the slide. I was looking at this, but maybe you can cover the slide more
Yes.
slowly and more...
Yeah, sorry. No.
More because I wasn't sure if this was the solution slide or not. So that,
Yeah, okay.
yeah.
Sorry.
Do this one again, but for people who don't understand Bitcoin.
Not sure I will be able to do it for people that don't understand Bitcoin, but I can go over it again. We introduce a new consensus rule. This consensus rule states that if the block you're receiving is on the edge of the difficulty adjustment period, if the block you're receiving is the first block in a difficulty adjustment period, its timestamp must not be less than 2 hours before the timestamp of the previous block. In addition, it's stricter. We introduce a new rule which just states the timestamp made. It's easier to state without the grace period. The timestamp of the first block in a period may never be lower than the timestamp of the block preceding it. And then we add some breathing room.
So the reason that works is because it takes 2 epochs, and it's the second one starting with the beginning time of the
Yeah.
Repeat it for the stream. Stop it from stacking.
Yeah, the only timestamp that matters at the end are the first and the last. So the last, actually, maybe a good segue into an interesting point. What prevents miner to always be able to just lower drastically the difficulty? They could just always set a timestamp as far in the future as they want, but they cannot. And they cannot because nodes refuse blocks that are received more than 2 hours than their current time. But how they base this check is not a consensus rule. They base this check on their system time. And all nodes on the network have different system time. So the only reason that Bitcoin works is due to some block policy kind of rule. Otherwise, it's broken.
Another question. And I was being a little bit sarcastic before, but I am paying attention. But I don't feel like this, quote unquote, is an absolute fix. It's just sort of like makes it better. Am I correct on understanding that?
You cannot exploit time warp. Forget about the grace period. You cannot exploit time warp if you have this rule. The rule, without the grace period, the rule states the first block in a period, its timestamp cannot be lower than its preceding block. That's all.
But isn't that between epochs? I thought that the whole point was you're only comparing between the epochs. Aren't you able to do time warps within the 2016 blocks or whatever in the middle?
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
The whole point is to be able to manipulate.
Yeah.
The question I have is I thought this was only doing the check at the 2016 epoch difficulty change period versus I feel like you're still able to manipulate it during the period itself.
Right.
Peter's saying no, so I assume I'm wrong here.
Peter, you want to answer if you understand the question?
Okay.
So this part I think has been answered already. The only thing that matters for the difficulty adjustment is the first and the last timestamp in a period. Anything that happens in between is completely irrelevant, except to the extent that the median time rule in between constrains you.
I get that.
Okay.
Can't you manipulate the median time rule while you're getting to that 2016 block and still have, like, it's not going to be as bad, but you still have this idea of semi-time warp attack? That's what I'm
No, the only thing that allows you to have this time warp is that because the first block in the period is bumping back in time. That's the time warp behavior, and this rule literally prevents you from jumping back in time.
I think the problem is I'm thinking about this the opposite way. Like, do you want to make it arbitrarily more difficult?
You're not the first to. There's been some discussion on delving Bitcoin with proposed attacks that try to exploit that, but they all go in the other direction. For a tiny correction, I think if we don't allow any grace period, you can technically still exploit it to an extremely tiny amount, because you expect a 10-minute increase between the last block of a period and the first block of the next one. And if you allow that to be 0, you can technically get slightly better than you would without it. However, this is compensated by the fact that the difficulty adjustment rule is already wrong, and you sort of allow as much as we're already off in the other direction. But
Yes, and this is also a good segue to mention that it has been discussed on Delving on a separate thread related to the consensus cleanup, where Peter has the math that goes through the current expected block interval time and with or without the fix. So it's interesting that because there is enough by 1, the block interval time is expected to be longer or smaller, and this fix is going to make it go into the opposite direction, so they compensate to some extent. But it's also kind of irrelevant to the big picture, because in any case, a miner would not be able to exploit it to get any meaningful advantage to steal future block subsidy. It's just interesting. All right, next block. I've got 4 minutes and 40 seconds. Keep the questions coming. That's what makes it interesting. Next up, expensive blocks. Oh, questions? No, okay. Expensive blocks. Okay, so actually this one I'm going to go into less details because the details of how to actually exploit it are private, but I can mention a few figures. I could come up with a block which takes 1.5 hours to validate on a Raspberry Pi, and this is assuming some reasonable circumstances for an attacker. Portland Huddle also demonstrated an even worse block at UpNext, which was assuming less realistic circumstances for an attacker. And the one at UpNext is like, I don't know, 20 or 30 minutes to validate on his MacBook Pro. So it's like, that's bad. That's bad for accessibility to the network for people with lower-end hardware to participate in the Bitcoin network, but it's especially bad for miner incentives. We don't want miners to have an incentive to delay their competition by sending them slow blocks, right? We want the mining competition to be an even playing field where miners only compete based on energy or hash rate. The fix that I'm proposing is to introduce a new limit on transactions, which is the number of potentially executed legacy signature operation per transaction. There was, I think that's the main difference between my proposal and Matt's earlier proposal, which took the approach of disabling some script functionalities. Script is the smart contract language in Bitcoin, and people raised concerns around very convoluted use cases that may be prevented by this fix and could therefore lead to confiscation. I think my proposal is way more constrained in terms of confiscatory surface. Any soft fork is going to have confiscatory surface, just to be clear. But my proposal is trying to really pinpoint the exactly bad behavior, so that, and then it leaves extensive flexibility, so people could have done very weird stuff that it would not be made invalid. For more details, see the BIP or ask a question. Next, molecular tree malleability. It would be bad if we had a block hash such as two blocks with not the same content had the same block hash. Well, it's the case. It's the case for other reason. There was other malleability in the Merkle tree which were fixed very early on. But there's one remaining one that we know of, at least, which relates to 64 bytes transactions. And the issue is that transactions, when building the Merkle tree, are going to be hashed, catenated together, and rehashed, and catenated together, and rehashed. The hash of a transaction is 32 bytes. When you catenate them, that's 64 bytes. 64 bytes is enough bytes to have a valid transaction by, like, a valid serialization of a transaction. This allows two things. First of all, it's been an issue for full nodes in the past, which is fixing it did not require a consensus change. But I think it's pointing out that it's really an issue at the core of how Bitcoin works. The issue for full nodes was that because the Merkle tree was malleable, an attacker could send a block to a full node, a new block, a block is created, an attacker is malleating this block with a 64-byte transaction that is invalid. Send it to the full node. The full node is going to request the block, validate it, and see that the block is invalid. Cache the block hash as being, I've already seen this block, it's invalid. Next, the honest miner is going to send it to the node, and the node is going to say, I know this block hash. I'm not going to validate that twice. I know it's invalid. Net split. It was fixed in Bitcoin 0.13, I think.
That would happen?
That was very easy to exploit. It's like it was 25 bits of brute force to go in this direction, I think. So a miner that wanted to send a valid block to half the network and the invalid one to the other half could definitely have pulled that off. However, it was only possible for a few versions of Bitcoin Core. The bug was introduced, and not long later, it was fixed. So it was fixed by just stop to cache very early in the validation process. So when Bitcoin Core validates a block, it does the less expensive operations first, and then it moves on to the more expensive ones. And so it was fixed by just not caching the very inexpensive operations, which is enough to avoid this attack. However, it's possible to go the other way around. You tell me when I need to go, because I'm out of time here, but if there was time for questions, 5 minutes? 5 minutes, cool. This is going into one direction. This stack is basically by faking that there is one level less in the tree of transactions to full nodes. But you can go in the other direction by faking that there is one more level in the tree. And for this, you use a 64-byte transaction, a valid 64-byte transaction that you commit into a block, and that is crafted such as it commits to a transaction that is not part of the block. It takes about 70 bits of brute forcing to achieve, so it's not for free, but it's practical. Yes?
I believe you can fake millions of transactions with this exploit, right? You can hide a Merkle tree under that 64-byte transaction and have millions of transactions that you can fake.
Probably, yes. Yes, I think so. Yes, fake inclusion of millions of transactions. So that's an issue for SPV verifiers, which is applications or protocols that are verifying Merkle proof of Bitcoin transactions to assess their validity. It's not only SPV wallet, because oftentimes this argument is mischaracterized as being only SPV wallet. But for instance, BitVM bridges use Merkle proof of Bitcoin transactions for peg-ins and peg-outs. So, yeah, so if they didn't have a mitigation for this exploit, you could basically sweep all the funds in the side system, which is pretty crucial. This, I call this more of a weakness because there is simple mitigation in practice that you can do which do not require changing Bitcoin's consensus rule. You can have your application request a Merkle proof in addition for the Coinbase transaction, in addition to the Merkle proof for your transaction. And because in Bitcoin, all the transactions are going to be on the same level of the Merkle tree, and this attack involves faking another level, as long as you have both proofs, you can just check they're on the same level and only accept such proofs. That's rather inconvenient, however, to do in some settings when you're constrained or when you do it on a side chain on some sort of smart contract or whatnot. So, and it increases the bandwidth requirements as well. Fix makes 64-byte transactions invalid. 64-byte transactions cannot be used for anything that is secure, which is they're too small to have a script pub key that meaningfully locks the Bitcoin. So either all 64-byte transactions that are valid today can either burn your funds or leave your funds to be spendable by anyone. And they have been non-standard for almost a decade. 7 years, I think. All right, final one. You stopped me. Still no question? All right, well, this was mostly a presentation then. The last one, again, which I qualify as more of a weakness because you cannot really exploit it, but I think if we're going to do a cleanup soft fork, that would be very nice to include, which is about duplicate transactions. Early on in Bitcoin, it was possible to have two transactions that have the very same TX ID because they're the very same transactions. Obviously, that's an issue. There is a very good blog post by Russell O'Connor called Midas Money about the exploit, and when he reported it to the Bitcoin Core developers at the time, it was immediately fixed, I would say in a rush, but with BIP30, the BIP30 validations to fix this vulnerability was for every block that you receive, you go through all transactions and you make sure that there is no UTXO in your UTXO set, which is there is no transaction output that remain unspent with the same TX ID. That's unnecessary work, unnecessary validation. It's not that expensive, but it's still unnecessarily expensive. And also, newer systems, such as UTXO, just cannot perform this operation. So it would, having to do this would downgrade UTXO to not completely be a full node anymore. It was later, the BIP30 fix, which was not ideal, what was later fixed through BIP34, which involved committing to the block height in the script sig of a Coinbase transactions, such as to make all transaction ID unique, because you have only one Coinbase per block height. Therefore, you're always going to have the same, a different TX ID for all Coinbase moving forward. But it's only moving forward from BIP34 activation. And before BIP34 activation, you had some Coinbase that had garbage in the script sig. Some of this garbage, for some of this Coinbase transaction, deserializes to a valid block height. So there is opportunities in the future to duplicate Coinbase transaction IDs again. So up until that point, BIP30 validation is disabled in Bitcoin Core, but it will have to be resumed in the future. It would be nice if we could just not resume this validation and if we could just simplify all this logic, such as not being possible to have duplicate TX IDs. Seems like good property to have for Bitcoin. The fix for this, that's the last slide. The fix for this involves basically time locking all your Coinbase transactions. You set the unlock time, the height -1 in the unlock time, and you mandate that the end sequence of the Coinbase transaction is anything but final, which is the maximum value. That's it. I think I don't have more time for questions because it was a Q&A in the first place. But if you need more information, if you want more information, there's the BIP. Well, I've put the pull request here, but it was merged. It was merged. It's BIP 54. You can find it in the BIP repository. If you want to dive deeper, if you want to delve deeper, you can go on delvingbitcoin.org, and there is all the threads with all the discussions I and many others had on the various vulnerabilities and mitigations, except the very worst block, which is in a private thread. Also, that's my Twitter and my Blue Sky, and if you follow me, I'm probably going to be talking about that a lot in the coming year, so you can get your updates from there.